Hi and welcome to Sci-Fi fans, and in this edition of the show I'd like to talk to you about one of the greatest minds when it comes to entertainment. Now, this gentleman was born in the 1930s, 1937 to be precise, and he created shows that would go on to be classics, but he did also create one or two flops. So the films and TV shows that he inspired and created were Battlestar Galactica, Knight Rider, Quincy CQ, um, as well as Magnum and Automan. The Fall Guy was also one of his hits. Who am I talking about? Well, it's got to be Glen A. Larson. Glen A. Larson was born on the 3rd of January in 1937, Long Beach, California, United States. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2014 at the age of 77. So that's quite young by today's standards, given the fact that he would only have been 87 had he lived to today. Now, the TV shows that he started and created were an inspiration for a generation, and they really did depict the times. But he didn't start off as a creator. Now, he has a writing credit on the TV show The Fugitive, which ran from 1963 to 1967. And The Fugitive is a story about Dr. Richard Kimball, who is falsely accused of his wife's murder. He escapes custody and searches for the real killer while being pursued by a relentless detective. This film, or this TV show, would then go on and be remade in the 1990s with Harrison Ford taking on the title role. So his first actual creation was Alias Smith and Jones, which was a Western. This was on the screens in the US, at least, in 1971 to 1973. Now, this was a Western series about two outlaws who tried to reform and earn amnesty by staying out of trouble for a year. This, I think, possibly got a little bit confused in the UK because we had two comedians that also run by the name of Alias Smith and Jones. They were quite popular back in the early 80s. And I do actually remember watching this particular show. Initially, I thought it was the comedy duo. In the mid 1980s, at lunchtime, it kind of got repeated here in the UK. Moving on to Glen Larson's career, in 1970 and 1977, he was a writer-producer on the TV show McCloud. This again is sticking with the Wild West. A cowboy from Taos, New Mexico, becomes a detective in New York. Then, after he had given us that, he became the creator, writer, producer of Quincy ME, which ran from 1976 to 1983. Jack Klugman starred as a medical examiner who solves crimes using forensic science, and that was probably an inspiration for shows like NCSI and Bones, because it all kind of follows on with that theme. One of his biggest hits, though, was yet to come, and that was the 1978 to 1979. And if you know his stuff and Sci-Fi, you'll know that this show, where he created, wrote, and produced, is none other than Battlestar Galactica, the original, a sci-fi series which is about a fleet of human survivors fleeing the robotic Cylons in search of Earth. It was a short-lived show, and I'll be going into more detail into these TV shows and what he created a little bit later in the episode. So I'm just running through his career and what he created. So after Battlestar Galactica, he created BJ and the Bear, which was a show that ran from 1979 to 1981. Now, his role on that was, again, creator, writer, and producer. The synopsis of the show was a trucker and his pet chimpanzee travel the country entertaining or encountering various challenges and adventures. Then, after that, he was the creator, writer, and producer on The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo, again, 1979 to 1981. So, this really is a busy time in his career. He then went on to produce another classic sci fi show, and that is, of course, Buck Rogers in the 21st Century. Again, credited as writer, creator, and producer. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Battlestar Galactica, it's about a 20th century astronaut who wakes up 500 years in the future and becomes involved in an intergalactic adventure. This also was post Star Wars, and it was really taking credit and taking full advantage of the sci-fi boom at the time. Something of a surprise is that in 1980 to 1988, this was how long this TV show run for, he was the creator, writer, and producer of Magnum PI, starring Tom Selleck as Thomas Magnum, a private investigator living in Hawaii. This was a massive hit, and it was known for its blend of action, drama, and humour, and also for Selleck's iconic performance. And I've seen documentaries on Magnum PI, and some of the interesting things, the helicopter scenes, and that it wasn't as straightforward as you would expect it to be. Magnum PI is one of Glen Larson's TV shows that was remade, and I think it's still being made, but we don't see many of the episodes here in the UK. Another show that is iconic, and that is Knight Rider, which was on the air from 1982 to 1986. Again, this was one of Glen Larson's creations. He wrote and produced the show. If you're unfamiliar, it was about a guy called Michael Knight, who was played by Hasselhoff, David Hasselhoff, and his high-tech talking car called Kit. And together, Knight Rider, so Hasselhoff as Michael Knight and Kit, they would go on and they would fight crime. It was on there at the same sort of time as the A-Team, and to be honest, I thought, given the genre of the two being action and adventure, that Glen Larson had something to do with the A-Team, but he didn't. Another one of my shows that I grew up with on Saturday mornings was The Fall Guy. This run from 1981 to 1986 and has since been remade as a film starring Ryan Gosling. They took a slightly more comedic tone on the film, and once I've watched it, I will probably review it here on the channel, so do stay tuned for that. A short-lived show that Glen A. Larson created was Automan. This only ran for one season and about 8 episodes, and again, he was the creator, writer, and producer. This, I think, was taking inspiration from the movie Tron, because they were kind of released at the same sort of time. And the basic premise of Automan was a computer programmer creates a AI superhero that helps in fighting crime. Again, only 8 episodes, so this show got cancelled quite shortly into the run. And another one of his TV shows, I think, it's the test of time to a degree, but it was quite short lived, and that is Mammimal, which was on air in 1983. The story behind Mammimal is a man can transform into any animal, and he uses this power to fight crime. So a lot of Glen A. Larson's TV shows are all about fighting crime. Cover Up in 1984 to 95. This was a fashion photographer and former Green Beret. They team up to solve crimes, so more crime fighting. And Knight Rider 2000 in 1991, where he was only credited as being the writer and producer, although obviously creating the original Knight Rider show. So going back to his earlier career and The Fugitive, it premiered on TV on September the 17th in 1963, and this was created by Roy Huggins. Glen A. Larson's role was just as a writer, as I mentioned. So what did Glen Larson create? So he created Alias Smith and Jones, which was on air from the 5th of January 1971, with the main characters Hannibal Hayes, alias Joshua Smith, and Jediah Kid Curry, alias Theodus Jones. It wasn't too bad a show, with the two outlaws earning their amnesty through doing good deeds in the Wild West. There was some inspiration. It was loosely based on the exploits of outlaws Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Um, it wasn't too bad, actually. It was entertaining, but it wasn't anywhere near as the classics that we got later on in Larson's career. Obviously, the genre was Western with comedic elements, with a total of 50 episodes. Now, McLeod in 1970, which aired 1970 to 1977, was created by Herman Miller and produced by Glen A. Larson. Again, sticking with the Wild West, with a cowboy from Taos, New Mexico, becoming a detective. Now, this show ran for 46 episodes, and it was a police. The genre was police procedural with Western elements. So, what would be the equivalent of that today? Probably something like what was the Chuck Norris show? Tell me in the comments. I can see it now. I can see the credits and that. Remember, what was it? Chuck Norris. Oh, I've lost it now. Anyway, getting back to what I can remember and what I do know. Quincy Emmy, 1976 to 1983. Dr. Quincy was played by Jack Klugman, and he always kind of finished off he rounded up the cases with kind of like a one more thing moment, which came synonymous with Steve Jobs. Setting for this show was Los Angeles, California. Now, this was actually based on real life forensic pathologists. It won the Jack Klugman Award for primetime, and 2 primetime Emmy Awards. The music was composed by Glen A. Larson as well. So this show did really highlight Glen A. Larson's talents for filmmaking and entertaining. Now, it was pioneering in its day because it was one of the first shows to focus on forensic medicine, given the fact that forensic medicine was only just starting and we were getting to know about genetics and everything at this time. It addressed social issues as things like pollution, drug abuse, and child abuse as well. So it was quite forward thinking and hard hitting with some of the topics that they covered. Catchphrase was quite obviously something that develops with TV shows, and Quincy frequently demanded, "How did she die?" It was on Universal Television, and it is one of those precursors of shows like NCSI and CSI. There was no direct spin off, but it did inspire the forensic genre as a whole. Moving on, though, the next show that Glen A. Larson created, 1978 and 1979, and this is one of the juicy ones for me, and that is Battlestar Galactica. Premiered on the 17th of September in 1978. The premise of the show, if you haven't seen it, if you haven't seen the original, is Commander Adama, Lorne Green, and Captain Apollo, Richard Hatch, and Lieutenant Starbuck, Dick Benedict. They are the few survivors of humanity after a civil war with a robotic race known as the Cylons, and they go on search for a quest of finding Earth as the 13th colony. There was only 24 episodes to this show, and obviously the genre being science fiction, it did get a lot of criticism for being like a Star Wars spin-off slash rip-off, although it was never connected to Star Wars in any shape or form. Excuse me. It has an iconic theme tune, and this was composed by Stu Phillips. The theme tune has been used in other films as well. Incidentally, the Aeroplane 2, it was used in the opening credits for that. Battlestar Galactica won a Special Achievement Award for visual effects and the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Films. It did get criticism because of it being on a low budget. They did repeat a lot of the sequences and reused footage. But for me, looking back at it, that's part of the charm. Now, there was a spin-off show called Galactica 1980, which for a lot of fans of Battlestar Galactica is a season and show that we generally don't talk about. It's kind of like the equivalent of Aliens versus Predator. If you're a massive Xeno fan, those films don't exist. There was a successful reboot, though, in 2004, but Glen A. Larson didn't have anything to do with that. The Battlestar Galactica did try and rival Star Wars on some fronts and the merchandise. So they did produce a toy line for this film, comic books and novels. Terry Hatch actually became very successful at continuing the story of Battlestar Galactica with various novels that he wrote himself. Incidentally, Terry Hatch was the only actor from the original Battlestar Galactica TV show to make an appearance in the reboot. Moving on with Glen A. Larson's career, we have BJ and the Bear, which was on air from 1979 to 1981. And this time, though, we come back down to earth. This show was a lot more successful, giving them 48 episodes. Now, it was an action-adventure comedy, and it was a spin-off from, or there were a spin-off from The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo. Various locations were used throughout the United States for filming this. Now, this was a light-hearted show with comedic elements. It was quite popular. It has a dedicated fan base, and it did have a bit of a toy line, including lunchboxes as well. Something that was very common in the early 80s, early to mid 80s with a successful TV show was a lunchbox. So if you was a real fan at school, you showed that dedication by having a lunchbox. So just imagine that you could be sat around a table, you'd have Transformers, Airwolf, Knight Rider, the A-Team, all on a lunchbox. You wouldn't get that so much these days, would you? So Buck Rogers in the 25th Century was produced and it was on air from 1979 to 1981. Now, this was a little bit more successful than Battlestar Galactica, and they did actually reuse and repurpose some of the sets. There is a theory to say that the stories would entwine and they were set in the same universe, which would have been interesting had the Galactica made it to Earth and had the Galactica made it to Earth, and Buck Rogers was there as well. Could have been an interesting mashup of TV shows, who knows? But we didn't have that, unfortunately. So Buck Rogers in the 21st Century first aired on our screens on September the 20th in 1979. It was based on a character created by Philip Francis Newlin. Now, there have been various copyright claims on who owns the character of Buck Rogers, because it has been used in various reiterations, confusing and muddying the waters as to who actually owns the copyright. It was the premise was a 20th century astronaut wakes up 500 years in the future. Now, there are some plot holes, I think, sometimes in this, if you want to be really picky, because our hero, Captain Buck Rogers, comes back to Earth 500 years and Earth has been annihilated by a nuclear war. So one of the plot holes for me, when you want to analyse it, and some people do, is how did he find the graves of his family, given the fact that the nuclear holocaust was hundreds of years in the past and everything was devastated? But that's just one of those things. The music was composed by Stu Phillips, and the villains, there was a whole variation of villains. Princess Adala as the Draconians, and then they kind of shifted it to a more, they went into space more with some of the future episodes. Twiki, there was Buck Rogers' sidekick, and he was voiced by Mel Blanc, and he was kind of like, he had a child mentality, and it was really interesting, and there was a good dynamic between Buck Rogers and Twiki, because he had to explain things, and it's a good show. If you haven't seen Buck Rogers, then why not? You can just grab yourself a copy on Amazon. It's quite reasonable. Now, there have been plans for a reboot, but these haven't materialised. And I think one of the reasons why they haven't materialised for Buck Rogers is, as I say, because of the copyright, who owns what kind of restrictions that they're under, because everything has to be crystal clear. Otherwise, people sue the arse off of you. Buck Rogers has become a cult favourite in the sci-fi community. The uniforms that Wilma has to wear as well probably helps it become a cult classic. Now, Glen A. Larson would then swap genres again and he came up with the TV show Magnum PI, which was on air from 1980 to 1988. It premiered on the 11th of December in 1980. The main character was Thomas Magnum, played by Tom Selleck, who incidentally almost ended up as Harrison Ford. I can't remember whether he turned the role down or whether they decided that he wasn't quite right for the part. So the premise of Magnum is a private investigator lives and works in Hawaii. Now, this TV show has been remade and rebooted for a modern audience, and we've seen a couple of the episodes. It's a bit difficult to watch these rebooted shows because they're not always on when we want to watch them. So, excuse me. So I have seen some of the episodes, and yeah, the reboot has the charm and some sort of feel of the original. And if we get a chance, we probably would sit down and watch it all over again. This TV show is probably one of Glen A. Larson's most successful TV shows, though, because it ran for a total of 162 episodes. The theme tune was composed by Mike Post and Peter Carpenter, set mainly on Hawaii and Oahu on Hawaii. One of the iconic things about this TV show is the opening sequence where we have Magnum's Ferrari 308 GTS, and the car is almost as big a star as Magnum himself. The helicopters played a big part. Now, there was a bit of a scandal with regards to the helicopters because they weren't speculation, opinion only, before I get the arse sued off me by saying something I shouldn't have. There is a theory, and there's some, well, as there is with any theories, there's always a bit of smoke, no fire. They did have a wonder whether or not the helicopters were being properly maintained, because there was an accident, and tragically some of the pilots and actors passed away. And this was very early on in production, but they managed to, I suppose they just done an investigation. They decided that everything was okay and they could carry on making the show, which is what they did. And that's how we ended up with the show that we got. Now, the accident and the helicopter that crashed was used in the opening sequence. There are various theories whether it was mechanical failure or pilot error, but I don't want to go into that here because I don't know. All I know is that there was a tragic accident, and one of the helicopters did actually crash. Magnum and his friends were Vietnam War veterans, and that was something that they did use a lot of in TV shows in the early 80s. Airwolf, for example, did focus a little bit on the Vietnam War, with St. John being missing. It won awards for Tom Selleck. He won an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor. It had a cultural impact on TV in the 1980s, and there was a spin-off and crossover with Simon & Simon, as well as Murder, She Wrote. And I'll probably be covering Murder, She Wrote on the channel because it's probably one of my guilty pleasures. I don't mind watching a bit of Jessica Fletcher if should I admit to that? I don't know. You tell me in the comments. As I say, the TV show was rebooted in 2018 with Jay Hendemers as Magnum. There was a catchphrase associated with this, and that is, "Don't you worry about it." Magnum did spawn some merchandise and memorabilia, but I think possibly Glen A. Larson's biggest hit culturally, and you can tell me if I'm right with this in the comments, just say yes, no, disagree. Knight Rider from 1982 to 1986. Again, Glen A. Larson created this phenomenal, starring David Hasselhoff. This TV show really put David Hasselhoff on the map, I think, as an actor. He played Michael Knight, who was originally a copper that got, I think he gets kind of bit like RoboCop. He's almost killed off, but not. They bring him back around after being in a coma for 6 months as a new person with a new identity, and of course, Kit. The premise is obviously a crime fighter is aided by a high-tech talking car named Kit. In total, there was 90 episodes. So not as many episodes as Buck Rogers, but I think Knight Rider had a little bit more of a lasting legacy for fans and toys because of the toy range that came along with it. with the genre for it was action adventure. The music has probably been sampled the most out of any TV series. It's just such an iconic tune, and it does get sampled in practically everything every decade. There will be some version of the theme tune. And that was composed by Stu Phillips. Kit, Night Industries 2000, was voiced by William Daniels. Now, for years, I thought William Daniels was the voice behind Yoda, but I soon found out that it wasn't. Kit was modified in 1982, or in 1982 rather. Kit was a modified Pontiac Trans Am, and I think that probably helped brand awareness, because when you're young and you're into your cars and your TV show, and you see something like Knight Rider coming along, yeah, it blows you away as a kid. Catchphrase for this show was "One man can make a difference." It was a cultural success in the 1980s, and there was a spin off which was called Team Knight Rider and Knight Rider 28, 2008. There was an extensive memorabilia toy collection with this show, and I think this is probably why it's stood the test of time, had one of the largest fan bases because of the accessibility to the toys and games that were available. Filming locations for Knight Rider were primarily in California. It introduced the concept of AI and self-driving cars. These, up until recently, have been pretty much things of science fiction. Now, there have been multiple attempts to revive the series, but I think you can't, what's the saying? You can't catch lightning in a bottle. This TV show, the original, will probably never be bettered by any remake. Now, one TV show that Glen A. Larson created, which almost inspired me as a kid to get into the film industry, was The Fall Guy. The Fall Guy ran from 1981 to 1986, and it premiered on TV screens on November the 4th, 1981. The main character was Colt Severs, played by Lee Majors. Now, Lee Majors was also known for The $6 Million Man. The premise is a stuntman who moonlights as a bounty hunter. And if you've seen the remake, the movie that came out recently starring Ryan Gosling, then you probably know about a bit more about this than some of those that haven't. It ran for a total of 113 episodes, and the theme music, The Unknown Stuntman, was actually sung by Lee Majors. The Jeep that he drives was a Colt's GMC Sierra truck, and that became just as iconic as Lee Majors. There was a supporting cast for this TV show, and that was Huey Monsoon as Douglas Barr and Jodie Banks as Heather Thomas. It featured actual stunts and stunt performances in a lot of the sequences, and these were actually performed by Lee Majors himself, who was actually a stuntman. It blended action with humour and drama, and it did win a couple of awards. Lee Major received a Golden Globe nomination. All right, so it didn't win it, but it got nominated. There were some various merchandise options with this particular show, but I don't think it really took off, because the main toy that I can remember about this TV show was the truck, because obviously everybody wanted that truck because it's shown in the opening credits. Lee Majors drives it. It performs its own stunts, if you get me drift. So yeah, I can see why the car is probably the only part of the TV show that I can remember. There was a catchphrase with this film, and that was "The Unknown Stuntman." So moving on to not so much of a hit in Glen A. Larson's career, and that was Automan. Now, my memory of this show is it wasn't actually that bad. Heavily Tron influenced, or heavily influenced Tron, because they both came out at the same sort of time. So graphic-wise, check this one out on YouTube and come back here and tell me what you think. Automan, 1983 to 1984. The main character, Walter Nibicher, was played by Des Arizan Jr., and the premise is a computer programmer creates an AI superhero named Automan. There was only 13 episodes, and I think this show got cancelled after its first season or at the very end of its before they got to finish the season, because sometimes they do that. They'll just pull the plug halfway through a season. So yeah, I remember this film. It is very much like Tron solving crime. So this didn't have that much of an impact really because of its short run. One of the reasons why they probably cancelled it though was because of the high production costs and low audience numbers. I think this is possibly one of those shows that, had they've given it a chance, it may very well have developed into a phenomenal hit because the ingredients were there. I mean, the AI creation that the cop creates, so his AI intelligence becomes a hologram, which you can see, and he interacts with him. But then not only that, he can create all sorts of things in the real world, and he creates a lot of the cars and the vehicles. So he creates a vehicle, helicopter, motorbike, and they all look like something out of a Tron film. Another TV show that wasn't as successful as it potentially could have been was Manimal. There was only 8 episodes in this series, and the premise of this, of having somebody who can transform into any animal that they can think of and then go around solving crime, is quite unique. Probably something that you'd only see these days in an animation or an anime. I think this show was possibly cut too short as well, but there was only 8 episodes. It didn't last particularly long, and probably budget constraints because, again, if you look at the time that these shows were being made, the special effects would have had to have been cutting edge to pull off the visuals, and they would have cost an arm and a leg. So you wouldn't have somebody, as you do now, being able to do it all on one computer and basically work alone. Cover Up was a show that ran from 1984 to 1985, and this is a fashion photographer and former Green Beret creates a team, and they go around solving crimes. So I really do get the impression that Glen A. Larson loved his crime solving mysteries. Now this show ran for 22 episodes, so one of his more successful TV shows. Lastly, the ill-fated Knight Rider 2000, which was premiered in 1991. Now, this was written and produced by Glen A. Larson, so he was credited with the original series, and that's probably why he's not credited as the creator, because he's already created it and been credited. Try saying that when you've had a few. So yeah, this was set in a future United States, the year 2000. So when this was being aired, they were expecting this to be something viable in 10 years' time. And we're only really just getting there with autonomous cars now. So that kind of shows how long the science has taken to catch up with the science fiction. They did change the car slightly. They called it the Knight 4000 instead of Kit 2000, and it didn't really do much. I have seen it, and I can understand why they didn't actually pick up this for a TV series, because it hasn't got the magic, and that is a sad thing. You can't catch lightning in a bottle twice. That's what they say, isn't it? There wasn't a lot of merchandise or anything really to talk about for this one. It just kind of died a death after the one episode. So that is it. That's my my rundown on Glen A. Larson's career and legacy, that he has given us some iconic shows, and these shows live on today, particularly with remakes. I mean, literally this year we've had a remake of one of his shows from the 1980s, The Fall Guy. As I say, once I've seen it, I'll give you a review on it and tell you whether or not it's any good. I think it flopped at the box office, but the premise was there for a good film, so who knows? As I say, I'll give you my thoughts. Thank you so much for listening in. I'll be back next week with some more movie chats, so take care of yourselves. And yeah, check out my YouTube channel, podcast, and TikTok channel as well. Take care of yourselves. New content coming out on a daily basis on YouTube. So if you want up-to-date content, that's where you'll find it. Take care. Back next week.